When I say China, what comes to mind? For many, the American perception looks largely like this. It's an overly simplified view in which the country seems to be defined by its communist government. Despite being the most populated country in the world, the Chinese people are largely ignored in our perception. And I want to explore this issue through its ties to censorship. Highlighted in the image behind me, China bans material, including pornography, criticism of the government, mentions of Tibetan and Taiwanese independence, along with anything else viewed as harmful to the state. As we look at this American perception of censorship in China, it's important to note that censorship takes place in a global online sphere. This image represents the connectedness of our online world. But what's missing? China. I want to understand the void of China in relation to American new media companies, which has really led me to question, what is the role of Western expectations of new media in China? The research thus far has largely focused on either American new media companies' connection to censorship or censorship's ties to Chinese culture. In answering this question, I want to bridge these three areas to really define how American perception of new media should relate to how new media acts in China currently and in the future. To do this, I'm going to look at three areas. First, I want to define new media. Then I want to describe what I mean by Western expectation. And then finally, I want to explore the cultural implications that this American mindset has on the Chinese people. If we look at, first, the easiest way to understand what new media is to compare it to more traditional media. Old media is defined by a one-to-many broadcast, meaning one broadcaster publishes information to many people with limited connectivity. For example, a TV company creates a TV show, broadcasts it to millions of people, but those viewers don't have access to communicate back to the content creator or with each other. With new media, it breaks these barriers and allows for a greater flow of information and communication among all users. And some examples of these companies include obvious ones like Google, Facebook, and Twitter, but also more traditional companies like Microsoft and Yahoo. And what these companies all share in common is that they all provide communication services like email and blogging, but also a greater access to information in general. And now that you hopefully have a better understanding of what new media is, I want to explain what the Western expectations of this new media in China are. By Western expectations, I really hope to get at how Americans expect American companies to act in China. But we really have to look at these two not as separate entities, but really as two pieces to a larger puzzle. And we have to see how American new media companies are expected to fit in with China. And even if they physically go together, do they belong together? And what role does free speech play in the way Americans perceive their interactions? If we look at Google, its story plays great into understanding how American new media companies are expected to act in China. In 2006, Google formally entered China. And what that means is they not only opened a Chinese-specific website, but also opened offices in China and agreed to self-censor their search results in accordance with the Chinese law. This caused a lot of outcry in America. For example, a few months after entering, the New York Times published this article in which it describes, in February, the company executives were called into congressional hearings and compared to Nazi collaborators. The company's stock fell, and protesters waved placards outside the company's headquarters. We can see how strong the reaction is, but in its defense, Google said that providing access to information, even in its censored form, it would be doing good. However, all this mounting pressure from Americans and conflicts with the Chinese government eventually led Google to pull out in 2010, and the tone quickly changed. CNN followed Google's exit and detailed another congressional hearing in which it goes on to describe, 2 days after Google stopped censoring search results in China, a congressional panel praised the company's actions. Lawmakers called on China to allow a free flow of ideas on the internet and sharply criticized Microsoft for continuing to be complicit with China's censorship laws. And as we see, there is an obvious shift in tone. But more so, the issue of operating in China falls solely in terms of censorship. This shows that the American perception of how new media companies are to operate in China is to not operate in China if that means censoring. And the drastic difference in reaction to the entrance and exit of Google really resonates with something in the following quote from Google's CEO. Eric Schmidt states, "I think it's arrogant for us to walk into a country where we're just beginning operations and tell that country how to run itself." What we can begin to see is a disconnect between American views of free speech with respect to how they should be applied to China. Which finally brings me to my third section, the cultural implications of this mindset. But before we can talk about these implications, I want to lay out a few key differences. And while these differences are largely generalizations, they provide a sufficient basis for the overall cultural context of these issues. The first thing we're going to look at is social structure. China's social structure is a strict hierarchy, meaning that each person realizes their place in society and fits somewhere on that social pyramid, as opposed to the idealized American structure, in which there's a strong sense of social equality and that everyone is inherently equal. And if we look at these different models in terms of censorship, it's easy to see how Chinese people are more willing to live under a government that maintains control over their lives, because their social structure contains this lopsided division of power in which people above you maintain more power than you. However, next I want to look at how confrontation on charged and controversial issues really plays a role in both of these societies. China's culture largely avoids speaking about controversial issues and rarely displays vows of public confrontation. However, in America, debating issues is not only accepted, but encouraged, as it's exercising one's American rights. And we can see that even if the Chinese people have this glorified free flow of information, the norms of what is acceptable to speak out in public already form self-censorship on the information that's going to be dispersed. And finally, we can look at the future outlook of these two societies. If we look at China, it's more long-term oriented, and this probably lends itself from the fact that it has over 5,000 years of culture behind it, as opposed to America, where we seem to be more short-term oriented. And these differences can really help us understand why Americans have this urge to change censorship now. But perhaps more importantly, it allows us to understand that overall, Chinese culture has a certain willingness to put up with censorship. In general, Chinese internet users know that if a website goes down, it'll be back up soon enough. And also, they realize that they're moving in the right direction and are patient, knowing that a more internet is already in the future. And now that I've described these differences, I really want to finish up by laying out the significance of these cultural implications. But first, I want to be clear on any misconceptions of what I'm saying. I'm not saying that censorship is a non-issue in China, or that Chinese citizens are happy being censored. What I am saying is that the current expectations in America are narrowly focused. We apply our Americanized views of free speech to a society whose culture does not lend itself to these same views as easily. And the consequence is that we've largely ignored the Chinese people, who are really at the heart of this issue. And it's amazing how we advocate for the Chinese people to have a voice in their internet, yet we don't give them a voice in this conversation. Americans are inherently biased in our views of censorship. And with the current dialogue, new media companies are really pressured to not operate in China. But I hope all of you can really take a step back and look at what is in the best interest of the Chinese people. I believe that American new media companies should operate in China, because what that means is it's not just about access to politically controversial information, but it really is With new media companies in China, they gain access to education, health information, news, and also they get experience with new technology. And all these terms fall far beyond what is traditionally considered connected with the term censorship. So, I realize that this issue is not a clear-cut issue. So I ask you to make your own decisions. But I want you to really consider the full aspect of Chinese culture, the people, along with Americanized views of free speech, before you force American companies to really act in any certain way.